Mike and Missy Vukoder have lived near Sarasota, Florida for 20 years and have been involved with hermit crab rescues and advocacy for about 10 years. Their first two hermit crabs were from a local pet store that was going out of business, and from those two crabs, their love for hermit crabs grew. They foster hermits through Reddit, Hermit Crab Association, Crab Street Journal, and various other groups. Through Crab Street Journal, local schools and teachers, the Humane Society, and their children's friends, they have been able to find homes for over 300 hermit crabs in need of new loving forever homes. They would like to thank all the adopters and caring people that donate their personal money, resources, and especially their precious time in helping hermit crabs in need. Mike and Missy also own 3 parrots and foster many others. During this presentation, you may hear some of them in the background. Please welcome Mike Vukoder.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Mike Vukoder, and I'd like to welcome you to this portion of the 2021 CrabCon. I'm sure many of you have read the short articles and seen the videos about Jonathan over the years. I often wondered what it would be like to have a big hermit crab walking around my house. Little did I know that a few years later I would actually get that opportunity. Today I'm going to talk a little bit about the time that we had spent with Jonathan Livingston Crab in the summer of 2019. Since most of us keep our hermit crabs in the tank and don't let them cruise around our house all the time, we thought it would be fun just to share our experience and kind of show everybody, give them a little glimpse into what it's like having a giant hermit crab live in your house and roam freely. Initially, we got in touch with Carol Ann Orms, that's Jonathan's owner, through Stacy Griffith with the Crab Street Journal. Stacy sent us an email asking if we had any larger size shells for Jonathan because, as Carol put it, he was going to be in a pickle soon if he didn't find any bigger shells. Unfortunately, we didn't have any shells even close to Jonathan's size. Everything we had was about 2-inch openings maximum. So we let Carol know that we would do our best to find him larger shells, and we would not be back in touch with Carol until January of the following year. In January, I called Carol just to find out how Jonathan was doing and how she was making out with the shells, and we ended up having a 2-hour conversation about hermit crabs. During the phone conversation, Carol Ann let me know that she was going to have some surgery done at the beginning of April, and that she would be off her feet due to physical therapy for a few months afterwards. She asked if we would be willing to watch Jonathan for a few months, depending on how long she was going to need to recuperate, and of course we wholeheartedly agreed. I had read about Jonathan, and he was one of the reasons that I got into crabbing in the first place so seriously, and there was just no way that we were going to say no to this opportunity. In the middle of February, we drove down to see Carol and get a little bit better idea of what type of enclosure he was kept in, what types of foods he was eating, how he was being kept, and just met Carol in person just to go over the basics of Jonathan's care, and that way I could get back home and get the preparations going. In our initial visit with Carol, she also let us know that she put Jonathan in his molt tub. It was just about time for him to molt, so another concern that we had was that would Jonathan be done molting before we had to transport him back to our house. We set up a 55-gallon tank for Jonathan. It had a saltwater pool, a freshwater pool, 2 cork bark rounds large enough for him to go down into and bury in. We filled them both with leaves and moss. The idea was to mimic the enclosure that he was kept in at Carol's all these years, and we just wanted to make sure that we gave him a little bit more room because our schedule was not going to allow us to have Jonathan out as much as Carol had. About 2 weeks before we were due to pick up Jonathan, Carol had sent us an email and let us know that Jonathan had shed his exoskeleton. This was great news. We had been waiting for this. You can see he's a bright, fresh lavender color here, and he is ready to chow down on that exoskeleton. About 1 week before we were due to pick up Jonathan, Carol sent us another email and let us know that Jonathan's molt was going well. He was starting to turn really dark. He had eaten a good substantial amount of his exoskeleton, and it looked like he was going to be ready to go for the transport to our house. Finally, the big day arrived at the beginning of April, and I drove down to pick up Jonathan. Drive down takes about an hour and a half, and I'll be honest, this is when my nerves started kicking in and my anxiety as well. I started to wonder exactly what I had gotten myself into. The look on Jonathan's face pretty much sums up how I felt on the inside, but Carol was very reassuring. She let me know that Jonathan was old and that if something should happen, it was just his time, and that I should just treat him like I do any of the other crabs and not to worry about it, and everything would turn out okay. Before I took Jonathan home, Carol was gracious enough to share a bunch of pictures with me of Jonathan through the years. I love the picture of Kate and John up in the tree. It really was a little bit of foreshadowing of what I could expect with a hermit crab walking around my house. I was also fortunate enough to get to see the original shells that Jonathan and Kate had when Carol had brought them home back in 1976. After a quick picture with Jonathan and a quick crabby hug from his mom, we loaded him up into his transport container and I headed down to the car. While I was loading him up, a nice gentleman neighbor of Carol's came by, and he wanted to let me know how much the crab meant to Carol and that I should take really good care of him. It really goes to show how much everybody in Carol's community cares about Carol and Jonathan, and they're always looking out for him down there. After the ride home, which gave me even more time to ponder what I had gotten myself into, we arrived at the house safe and sound, and Missy let Jonathan out of his travel tub. As you can see, he's just about done molting, and he is an enormous hermit crab. On day one, we just wanted to get Jonathan back home into his new environment and just let him relax and get used to his new surroundings. So we did that, and you can see here he's eating some of his exo that was still left over from his molt. He didn't have too much left, I would guess about a teaspoon or so. Carol had let us know that he had pretty much eaten all of his exo and that he was a little bit lethargic and off from his normal self, but it shouldn't be too long until he was ready to go. Before I get into the day-to-day life and the activities that we did with Jonathan, I wanted to explain a little bit about the food that Carol had sent home with us. You can see freeze-dried shrimp. There was a hermit crab treat, which was tropical fruits and a little bit of sea salt. There was also a calcium supplement, some green sand from Crab Street Journal, worm castings, and a natural mineral supplement, which I assume was azomite, but I didn't try it to find out. The 8.5 by 11 paper pictured is not a mistake. Jonathan really loved to eat paper. Missy had caught him sneaking into the office a couple times in our shred pile, and he was just tearing paper up. So you may see 8.5 by 11 paper in some of the pictures, and that's because Jonathan just loved to snack on it. After we were comfortable that Jonathan was not stressed out and he was pretty settled into his new environment, it was time to let him out of the tank and let him cruise around the house. He seemed pretty excited to get out of the tank and started cruising over to all the larger shells that we had. You could see that our bird was really keeping a close eye on Jonathan. They were never very comfortable with that big crab walking around, and they always kept a close eye on him. Jonathan really seemed to take a keen interest in the new shells. Carol had warned us that he was on the lookout for a new shell, so we were really treated when he started to look over the shells, measure them, and then he began to change shells. Now, Jonathan had already taken about 10 or 15 minutes to check out the other shells, and he decided to settle on this banded jade. Being so large, you really get a good view of what all those little arms and legs are doing in there. I had expected Jonathan to change shells at some point, but for him to change shells here on the second day was a real treat. It was really amazing to be able to witness this in person. I was also glad I actually had my phone on me so that I could take a video. Unfortunately, after his vacation, it just turned out that I didn't take as many videos as I wished I had. So this was a lucky treat. Right about now, he is in that shell. And at this point, I was thinking, all right, this is great. He likes the shell. He should be ready to get up and move around and check it out. But I was completely wrong. With no other crabs around for competition, Jonathan decided to take his time and do a few final measurements here. It's actually pretty funny. I don't know what he was thinking here, but he messes around a little bit more with this shell before he finally decides, okay, this thing's good enough. Here he's just kind of pushing that shell out of the way. Looks like he's doing a few minor adjustments inside the shell, getting him sort of turned around the right way. And then he is ready to start cruising around. Pretty cool. After Jonathan walked around for about a half an hour, I put him back in the tank. I was worried because he had a new shell and he was going to need some water to fill that up. And I also wanted to make sure that he was pretty happy with his new shell. After a few final measurements and a little bit of checking there to see, if this was going to work or not, he went over to his favorite mirror and checked himself out. Carol had sent this mirror home with me and let me know that it was one of his favorite toys and it had to be in his tank, and sure enough, he really enjoyed it. We also put a disco ball in his tank, mainly because it's shiny and just like the mirror, and sure enough, he loved that thing too. He was always batting it around with his legs or staring at it. It was pretty humorous. Carol had also sent me home with one of Jonathan's favorite rocks, pictured here. I was a little skeptical about the rock, about as much as I was about the 8.5 by 11 paper. But after a few days of watching Jonathan, I noticed that he really did enjoy hanging out on that rock, and I usually caught him sitting on top of it. When Jonathan was in his tank, one of the favorite hide spots of his was down in this big cork bark hide. I would put damp moss in there for him to hide, and he would go down in there all the time. That's really where he loved to sleep. I even sent this exact cork bark home with Carol, and she shared pictures with me over the next year or so of Jonathan sleeping in that thing all the time during the day. So he really, really enjoyed that cork bark hide. While Jonathan was spending time at our house, I had made an arrangement with the Humane Society in Pinellas County to visit them every Tuesday for about an hour and talk to the kids about hermit crabs and teach them about our native species down here in Florida. I had gotten the contact information from Stacy Griffith at Crab Street Journal, and it really turned into a great opportunity and experience for the kids to learn about hermit crabs and get to meet and interact with the world's oldest hermit crab. Jonathan was able to accompany me on these trips with Carol's permission, and he was the perfect ambassador for hermit crabs. Every time I would bring him out, all the cell phones would come out, pictures were taken, and that's when the questions really started. Even the teachers would come from different buildings to check him out. Nobody could believe how big he was or how old he was, so it was a real treat. At the end of the camps, I think we reached over 140 kids. So Jonathan was just amazing on all these trips. He would walk around the tables, and he was just the perfect ambassador. During normal days, whenever I would get up in the morning and turn the light on in the tank, this is usually how Jonathan would greet me. He would start moving his legs around and hitting the tank, and I believe that was his signal that it was time to let him out of the tank and for him to get moving. On another occasion, Missy and I had made a road trip around Florida for about 3 days and picked up about 12 hermit crabs that we had rescued from different people. Jonathan was super curious about these little guys. He was right up against the tank, wondering what was going on. We had let a couple of them out on our lanai, and Jonathan followed him around, and then he went on his own business. He was just a curious guy, always wondering, what we were doing, what's going on, what's all this new stuff around. Here's a close-up picture so you can get an idea of just how big Jonathan is. He's next to a 1-inch opening hermit crab here, a little small guy, juvenile still. You can see he's 10, 20 times as big as that little crab. Here's another picture just to get a little bit of scale and try to understand how large he was. Jonathan's shell was as wide and as tall as a 12-ounce can of soda. So he was a big boy. Jonathan also seemed to like TV. I don't know if it was the flashing lights or the movement that caught his attention, or possibly he's just a huge hockey fan. But I did notice on many occasions that I would catch him just staring at the TV. At one point, I had to make a tank up for a science teacher, and of course, Jonathan was right in the middle of it. As soon as I brought the stuff out, he walked right over to make sure that I was building it up to correct hermit crab specs. At one point, we decided to see how Jonathan would react around other hermit crabs. Missy and I have a very large crab named Goliath, and we thought the two of them would be perfect to see exactly, how their interaction would be if we put them together. Jonathan hadn't been around another hermit crab for about 7 years, so we weren't exactly sure what to expect. There was a lot of antenna bumping and gesturing, but overall, Jonathan didn't seem to be too concerned about other hermit crabs. He would just do a little meet and greet, and afterwards just go about his business in a separate direction. I never did leave him alone with another crab for any amount of time, just due to his safety. But he seemed to be pretty receptive to other hermit crabs. We tried to take Jonathan outside as much as we could on our lanai. That's basically like a screened-in porch. He also really enjoyed it at night. He would go out there and we'd give him bananas and some water to drink. Carol had told me to keep an eye on him and make sure that he didn't tire himself out. And that usually was the case. He would walk around for a few hours, and then I would find him just sort of resting somewhere. And that was my signal to go ahead and put him back in the tank. It may have been that Jonathan was restless to get home, but you can see that he had torn down all of the green plants that I had put in the tank. He wasn't really eating them, but he just kept tearing them down, and I kept taking them out until finally there was just nothing left. Jonathan even managed to put a hole in one of the shells that we had for him. He wore it around for about a day until he finally switched to a non-destroyed shell, but that was a little bit disappointing. There's only so many of these large shells that I had on hand, so everyone was precious, and it was unfortunate that he put a hole in this one. This was my favorite shell that he wore. It's just a banded jade, but it had the little knobs sticking out on it still, and it fit him really well. The shell just seemed to fit his personality. I don't know why, but the blues and greens and the pearl, and he fit perfectly inside that shell, and he walked around like he was a king in that thing. With about 2 weeks left before the end of Jonathan's vacation, I took a trip with our chinchilla Rufus and Jonathan in tow down to Carol's place just to see how she was doing and if she was ready to have Jonathan back home again. Rufus and I had a lot of fun on this trip with Carol and her neighbor Julie. Rufus got so much love that day, and he slept the entire ride home. Finally, the day arrived that I had to pack up Jonathan and take him home. I'm not sure if it was coincidence or not, but Jonathan started getting a little bit active as I pulled into Carol's complex down there. I also breathed a huge sigh of relief that he made it back. Of all the pictures I took, this was definitely my most cherished. I think it just encapsulated perfectly Carol and Jonathan and the relationship that they had. I was just sitting on the other couch talking to Carol, and Jonathan's walking by, and everything just seemed so normal around there. And at this point, I pretty much understood it. So what exactly did I learn from all of this? First, I learned if you let a hermit crab out in your house, they are going to disappear if you don't keep an eye on them. They are expert hiders, and once they hunker down, they are extremely hard to find. And if you're really lucky, you may even find some brown frowns laying around for you. I also learned that you need to have the proper shells. My shell game was not very good. Throughout the video, you can see Jonathan switch shells 7 times that I counted. He was just never satisfied. A couple months after I had taken Jonathan back home, I managed to get my hands on 24 of these beautiful banded jade shells, of which only 5 were in his size. I took the shells down to Carol, and we sat on the floor and watched Jonathan check them over. He didn't switch that day when I was down there, but I think Carol told me he switched a few days later into one. He seemed really happy, so that was a real bonus there to get him into a shell that actually fit him. The last thing I wasn't prepared for was all the generous gifts from people from all over the world for Jonathan. He received custom-made food dishes, some really awesome shells from South Korea, as well as poems, cards, emails, texts, all wondering how Jonathan was making out. It was really amazing to see how many people all over the world knew about John, outside of just a small group of crab people that I knew. It's really amazing and pretty impressive. Thank you all for taking the time and watching this today, and I hope you enjoyed it.